Καλησπέρα σε όλες, σε όλους, σε όλα. Νιώθω ιδιαίτερη τιμή που θα συστήσω στο βιβλιοφιλικό κοινό των Χανίων την Katie Kitamura, μια συγγραφέα που ανατέμνει με μοναδική λογοτεχνική οξυδέρκεια την ψυχή και την υπόσταση του σύγχρονου ανθρώπου. Και για να αυθαιρετήσω, συνδέοντας την κεντρική θεματική του φετινού Φεστιβάλ Χανίων, το κόσμο σε σύγκρουση, με το έργο της, θα πω ο εαυτός μας ως ένας ολόκληρος κόσμος σε σύγκρουση και ελπίζοντας να αυθαιρέτησα αρκετά, κυρία Κιταμούρα, πραγματικά νιώθω τεράστια τιμή που είμαι απόψε μαζί σας εδώ και σας καλωσορίζω και εκ μέρους του Φεστιβάλ Βιβλίου Χανίων. Καλώς ήλθατε.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and it's an honor to be here with you.
Θα συνεχίσω με μια μικρή εισαγωγή στο πρόσωπο και στο βιβλίο και αμέσως μετά θα ακολουθήσει συζήτηση. Θα υπάρξει χρόνος για 2-3 ερωτήσεις που μπορείτε να απευθύνετε ευθέως στη συγγραφέα. Η Katie Kitamura, ένα ελεύθερο δημιουργικό πνεύμα που καταγράφει τον κόσμο μας μέσω της σπουδαίας της λογοτεχνίας, ζει τα τελευταία χρόνια στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες σε ένα πολιτικό περιβάλλον αυταρχισμού, το ίδιο πολιτικό περιβάλλον που επιχειρεί να αλλάξει τον κόσμο με βίαιο τρόπο, με ανίκαιο τρόπο και να υποβαθμίσει την ανθρωπινότητα, θέτοντας όρους φιλετικούς, έμφυλους, ταξικούς για να την αναγνωρίσει. Θα μιλήσουμε μαζί της και γι' αυτό. Σε κάποια λίγα βιογραφικά της στοιχεία, είναι καθηγήτρια δημιουργικής γραφής στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Νέας Υόρκης, πολυβραβευμένη και φιναλίστη για μεγάλα διεθνή βραβεία. Τα βιβλία της δεν είναι μόνο οι λέξεις που γράφει, είναι και οι αποσιωπήσεις που παρεμβάλλονται ανάμεσά τους. Είναι γενικά ό,τι μας σωθεί να κοιτάμε τις ίδιες τις λέξεις στην πολλαπλή εκδοχή τους. Το τελευταίο καθηλωτικό της μυθιστόρημα, η Οντισιόν, που κυκλοφορεί από τις εκδόσεις Διόπτρα και βρέθηκε στη βραχία λίστα των βραβείων Booker για το 2025, είναι μία ιστορία, δεν είμαι καν σίγουρη αν είναι μία ιστορία, αν είμαι σωστή, για τους ρόλους που υποδιόμαστε καθημερινά, τις πολλαπλές εκδοχές του εαυτού μας και τα ασαφή όρια ανάμεσα στο επιθυμητό και το πραγματικό. Και μας οθεί στη μεγάλη παραδοχή ότι ο εαυτός μας είναι σχεσιακός, δηλαδή με πολλούς τρόπους ετεροκαθοριζόμενος. Το φετινό φεστιβάλ έχει ως θέμα τους κόσμους σε σύγκρουση. Πριν μπούμε λοιπόν στο βιβλίο που περιέχει μια συγκλονιστική εσωτερική σύγκρουση από αυτές που αναδιατάσσουν την ύπαρξή μας, θέλω να μιλήσουμε, κυρία Κιταμούρα, για τη θέση σας σε μια αυταρχική Αμερική που έχει καταστεί ο μεγάλος παγκόσμιος φορέας συγκρούσεων. Συγκρούσεων που δεν αφορούν μόνο τα εκτός της Αμερικής, το Ορμούζ, τη Βενεζουέλα ή ό,τι άλλο φανταστεί στο μέλλον ο Ντόναλντ Τραμπ ότι τον απειλεί και θέλει να επεκταθεί, αλλά και το εντός της Αμερικής. Αυτή η αήθης επίθεση στο μεταναστευτικό, η έμφυλη επιθετικότητα, οι φτωχοί άνθρωποι, η περιφρόνησή τους, η περιθωριοποίηση των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων. Πώς αντιλαμβάνεστε εσείς αυτή τη Νέα Αμερική? Και το ρωτώ με αφορμή μια δήλωσή σας στο Guardian. Ο Τραμπ και οι σύμμαχοί του προσπαθούν να αφαιρέσουν οτιδήποτε αγαπώ και με νοιάζει.
It's a big question. I feel very sad about everything that is happening in the United States. I suppose I have two thoughts. One is that it's quite frequently people say that it is what Donald Trump is doing is un-American, and that what is happening in the United States right now is un-American. And I understand deeply what they mean, but I also feel that there is a certain amount of continuity between Donald Trump and the history of the United States, which has often and quite consistently been wedded to imperialism and to violence. And we know this. And that has been both in terms of its foreign policy, but also domestically. You know, I am Japanese American. I grew up in California, and I grew up in a community of Japanese American citizens who had quite a few of the elders in my community where I was growing up had been interned during the Second World War. So they were citizens, and they were swept up, and they were put into camps in the middle of the desert. They lost all of their possessions. They lost all of their rights. So everything that is happening is absolutely horrific, and in many ways, to me, unimaginable. It continues to be hard for me to fully grasp the reality of what is happening in the United States. But I think at the same time, I have to acknowledge and recognize the fact that it did not come out of nowhere, and that in some ways it is consistent with American national identity. Having said all of that, it is a very frightening time. I think the descent into authoritarianism has been much faster than people predicted. It has been unusually fast, I believe. And of course, as a writer, I feel very much that much of this battle is taking place in the terrain of language. And that sounds quite abstract, except that with this administration, it's incredibly literal, because almost from the first days of the administration, there was a selection of words that you could not use, for example, in your applications for science funding. You could not use words like diversity. You could not use words like female or woman, for example. Of course, almost immediately, the use of certain pronouns was challenged. Even things like renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. All of this took place in the realm of language, and it is frightening to me because it says to me that actually the administration, which at times can seem very hapless, and I think certainly during the first administration, you know, people felt it was almost laughable that they were incompetent in some way. In fact, they understand very well the power of language, the danger of books, the power of the media, and those are things they have consistently attacked from the very, very beginning of this second administration. Book bans are at a much higher rate than ever before in the United States. Of course, the media and independent media is fully under attack at the moment in America. So it is a very bleak landscape. But at the same time, I will say there are moments that do give me a great deal of inspiration and profound admiration. There was, I don't know if people in here will have followed it, but there was a number of ICE raids in Minneapolis, in the state of Minnesota, where they actually shot and killed and murdered multiple people. But there was a kind of fearlessness within the population there. They were looking out for their neighbors, some of whom were undocumented. They were protecting them. They were risking a great deal. They were literally risking their lives in order to adhere to this idea of what America could and should be. And to me, that is very moving. And I think that there are pockets of that all across the country. And so for that reason, I do have reason for optimism. Also, I have to say, I live in New York, and we have a fantastic mayor, and we've just had some very good local elections. So I'm allowing myself a moment of small optimism.
Χαίρομαι πάρα πολύ που θίξατε το ζήτημα της αποσιώπησης, δηλαδή το γεγονός ότι στεκόμαστε απέναντι στην ιστορία μας λίγο σαν να μην την ξέρουμε και λίγο σαν να μην αφορά το παρόν, ενώ δεν είναι φυσικά καθόλου έτσι. Όντως η Αμερική έχει ένα παρελθόν και τίποτα δεν γεννήθηκε τώρα. Επίσης, χαίρομαι πολύ που αναφερθήκατε στη δύναμη των λέξεων. Μου θυμήσατε μία συνάδελφό σας από το Πανεπιστήμιο της Νέας Υόρκης, σε μία διάλεξή της, που είχε πει ότι ο Τραμπ έχει σκοτώσει την Αμερική με τις λέξεις του στην πρώτη θητεία. Η επόμενη θητεία, λοιπόν, αυτή ήταν παρεπόμενη και ουσιαστικά συνεχίζει αυτό το έργο. Ας πάμε όμως λίγο, ας έρθουμε στην Οντισιόν, γιατί εδώ βλέπουμε μια άλλη σύγκρουση, βαθιά και εσωτερική. Είναι η σύγκρουση των αντιφάσεων, για παράδειγμα, ανάμεσα στην αλήθεια και στην ερμηνεία της. Θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω αν πιστεύετε ότι οι μεγαλύτερες συγκρούσεις μεταξύ των ανθρώπων γίνονται με βάση αυτή την διάσταση. Ότι άλλο είναι η αλήθεια και άλλο είναι η ερμηνεία της.
That's a really wonderful question, and it's a very interesting question to think about right now. I mean, it's very interesting to write fiction because whether you intend it or not, I think invariably you are reflecting the historical and political moment from which you are writing in a lot of ways. And so this book, in a lot of, which was written, I would say, between kind of 2020 and 2024 maybe, which is not ostensibly really about politics in any way, nonetheless is about exactly what you just said. It is about the construction of reality, and it is about a really profound cleaving that takes place where there is no shared reality. And I think that is a great deal of what we have seen in the United States and perhaps in the world in general over recent years, is this sense that we are, you know, two people can be looking at the same thing and they can be seeing something that is profoundly different. I think that has collective ramifications, but in the case of this novel, I was really interested in looking at it in a very, very micro scale through the lens of one character. And so the novel is about a woman who is in the middle of her life. She is an actor. She is happily married. She's quite successful. She has seemingly the perfect life. And that life is upended when a young man, a very charismatic young man, approaches her and tells her that he believes that he is her son. And then from that point, there are, I guess I could say, two realities in the book. There are two possibilities, one world in which he is her son and one world in which he is not. And I think for me, the starting point of the novel was really this question of what you do in the face of an impossible demand from a stranger. When somebody asserts a certain reality very, very powerfully to you, how do you respond? And I think, you know, the book opens with the character. She's outside a restaurant and she's trying to decide whether to go in or not to meet this young man. And somebody opens the door for her, and it's in response to that kind of invitation, that injunction, that she goes in and the story kind of begins. And I'm very fascinated by the way in which we feel these social pressures to accept the invitations, the worlds, the realities that other people impose onto us. And I think that's perhaps particularly the case for some women. I'm hopeful that it's changing, but I think especially this kind of female position of accepting rather than imposing a reality was something I wanted to think about in this novel.
Θα επιστρέψω, αλλά μου δώσατε τώρα το ερέθισμα να συζητήσουμε λίγο για την γυναικεία εμπειρία και την επιτέλεση. Περίπου διαβάζουμε στο βιβλίο σας ότι η μητρότητα είναι μία επιτέλεση. Ότι δηλαδή, στη μια περίπτωση η ηρωίδα σας δεν είναι μητέρα, το ίδιο πρόσωπο. Μέχρι το μέσο του βιβλίου υπήρξε μια αποβολή, δεν ξαναέκανε καμία απόπειρα, μάλλον έκανε μια απόπειρα, αλλά δεν έγινε μητέρα. Στη δεύτερη, ο ίδιος νεαρός είναι ο γιος της. Θεωρείτε ότι παίζει έναν κοινωνικό ρόλο μια μητέρα, δηλαδή ότι είναι ένα κοινωνικό γεγονός η μητρότητα και ότι ασκούμαστε σε ένα ρόλο εμείς οι γυναίκες έμφυλο.
So, hi. Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure this was on. I mean, I suppose I have two thoughts. One is that the book is about an actor, and I'm very interested in the role of performance in our everyday lives and the way in which we enact certain parts, often without even being aware of it. And I think that is absolutely true when it comes to motherhood, and I'll touch on that further. But I think it's true more generally. You know, I think an example I often think of is when you get married, which is a very intimate matter in so many ways, you're marrying the person that you hope to spend the rest of your life with. It's in the United States, there's a kind of script that you follow when you exchange your vows. People say the exact same words, millions and millions of people. This occurs in front of an audience, in front of a gathering. It's something that is not entirely private. Instead, it's something that is public and that is constructed as a performance. And so I think we're using performance all the time to ratify some of our most important experiences, but also just to understand what it means to be in the world. And I think often there's a negative construction with the idea of performance and identity, as if, you know, I think about I have children, and one of the worst things you can say about another child is that she's really fake. You know, they'll say, I don't want to play with her, she's really fake. But in fact, when you look at children, you see that from a very young age, they are engaged in very active role play. They are pretending to be a bus driver, a teacher, a mother. And it is through that role play that they learn what it means to be a person in the world. They learn how to exist and how to function and how identity is formed. And that is seen as incredibly natural and very, very healthy. It's fascinating to me that it's as if once you reach adulthood, that stops. And all of a sudden, the idea of role play or performance is seen as in some way artificial and suspect. And I don't think myself that's the case. I certainly think that when it comes to motherhood, I think we are told by the culture that it is a natural, organic, something that will happen to you immediately, that you will understand what it means to be a mother and how to be a mother. In my own personal experience, that is not the case at all. I think there's a lot of ways in which you have to learn to be a mother, but I think also when I had my children, I felt very aware of the degree to which I was being influenced by the models of motherhood that I was seeing around me, whether that is in the culture, in the media, within my immediate peer group. I live in Brooklyn, which is full of mothers, or in fact from my own childhood. And so I became very acutely aware of the fact that in this very close relationship that I have and had with my children, nonetheless, there is this kind of sense of these ghosts of other mothers and versions of mothers always interceding in a way. And I was very interested by that, and I was always very interested when I caught myself performing a role in some way. And that's, I suppose, where this book came from.
Εγώ διαβάζοντας πάντως το βιβλίο και την συγκεκριμένη ιστορία, ένιωσα ότι όπως θεωρητικά, φιλοσοφικά η Μπάτλερ τεκμηρίωσε την επιτέλεση του φύλου, ότι εσείς λογοτεχνικά υποστηρίξατε την επιτέλεση της μητρότητας ως δηλαδή μία μορφή ρόλου που αρχιτυπικά καλούνται οι γυναίκες να παίξουν. Για να επιστρέψουμε όμως στους ρόλους, φυσικά καθόλου τυχαίο δεν είναι ότι ο κεντρικός σας χαρακτήρας είναι ηθοποιός. Παίζει πάρα πολλούς ρόλους, παίζει διαρκώς ρόλους. Με έναν τρόπο μας λέει ότι παίζουμε όλοι μας ρόλους στη ζωή διαφορετικούς κάθε φορά. Και εγώ αναρωτιέμαι πότε σταματάει και αν σταματάει αυτή η παράσταση ή είναι όλη μας η ζωή αυτό, δηλαδή ο εαυτός μας κατασκευάζεται αποκλειστικά μέσα από τους ρόλους που καλούμαστε. Από την παιδική μας ηλικία μέχρι το τέλος της ζωής μας να παίξουμε. Και γι' αυτό είναι και ρευστή και η ταυτότητά μας, διότι η επιτέλεση συνεχίζεται για πάντα.
I think it's very hard not to be shaped by the sense of other people watching, and to perform to that in some way, to perform to a model or expectation. And I think whenever I'm writing characters, I'm really interested in the fact, in the way they reflect a kind of human quality, which is that you are different with different people, and you are different in different situations. And so, you know, a character is going to be different if they are in a police station, in a meeting at a school, about their child, if their child has done something, talking with their friends. And all of these different identities, these kind of shards of identity form part of who we are. I think one of the kind of great, I don't want to say lies, but one of the great illusions is that there's a fixed identity which can contain all of them. I think, in fact, that, you know, it is a very, very fluid thing. And the characters that I'm interested in writing, I think, are the characters who don't have the comfort of the illusion of a consistent personhood. I think, you know, they're often surrounded by characters who are very confident about who they are and who seem to move through the world in a very secure way. I think, in fact, they are as unstable, perhaps, as my central characters are, but the difference is that my characters are able to perceive that kind of gap between the world, the face they present to the world and the face that they have inside. And that is very much what I'm interested in thinking about in fiction.
Με αφορμή τον τίτλο «Οντισιόν», που τι είναι «Οντισιόν», είναι η δοκιμασία όπου κάποιος κρίνεται αν μπορεί να υποδηθεί ένα ρόλο στο θέατρο ή στο σινεμά. Θέλω να κάνουμε προβολή του τίτλου στην πραγματικότητα και διαρωτώ με αν μέσα από το δικό σας το κείμενο διαβάζουμε ότι αυτό είναι η ζωή μας, δηλαδή ότι είναι μια συνεχής οντισιόν για να ανακαλύψουμε όμως τον εαυτό μας, ποιοι πραγματικά είμαστε.
It's really funny because for a very long time I had a different title for the novel. The novel was titled Performance, and I think the book was not quite about to go to the printers, but it was very, very late in the kind of editing process, and my American and my English editor both suddenly said that title's not going to work, we have to change it. And so I changed it to Audition, in part precisely because of this sense that all of the characters in the book, but I would say most particularly the character of the young man who kind of presents himself as a son, and there's a kind of line where he says that she observes that he gives good son, and he's kind of very good at playing this role, playing this particular identity for this couple. But at my second event that I did for the book in the United States, the first question, a man raised his hand and said, "Why is this book called Audition when clearly the title of this book is Performance?" So it was a kind of last minute change of title. But I think I understand why the editors wanted that title, because I think there is a kind of tension to it, and there is a question. And a question of, because of course you go in for an audition, but you can get the part, but you can also fail the audition. And I think that is very much at work between the three characters all the time. The three central characters in the novel are this couple and this young man. And there's a sense in which the young man, of course, is trying to be their child, both whether or not you understand him to be their son or not. But also there's a question within their marriage as well, whether or not, I would say, the husband is very much trying to adjust and react to the central character, this woman. And he as well is constantly kind of reaffirming his role as her husband. So I think I was absolutely interested in thinking about this instability, the instability around the word audition, and how it could play into defining the relationships between those three characters.
Φτάνουμε στο τέλος του βιβλίου και αντιλαμβανόμαστε, κυρία Κιταμούρα, ότι εμείς έχουμε να δώσουμε την απάντηση και όχι εσείς σχετικά με την αλήθεια του κειμένου, και αναρωτιέμαι πώς είναι να αφήνει κάποιος όλη την αλήθεια του στον αναγνώστη. Πώς ένας συγγραφέας δηλαδή το κάνει αυτό, γιατί υπάρχει μια συνέντευξή σας στο New Yorker που λέτε ότι το Οντισιόν λειτουργεί σαν ένα τεστ κυλίδων Ρόσχαρ, όπου ο αναγνώστης επιλέγει ποια εκδοχή της ιστορίας θέλει. Πώς είναι αυτό, γιατί το κάνατε?
I mean, I guess I should say this is a book that is very, very open to interpretation. It was, I wrote it so that there were at least 4 different ways to read the book. And I wanted to leave it to the reader to decide which one they felt was the real one. Or I suppose real one is the wrong word, but whichever version of the book that they preferred. And I think there are a number of reasons for doing that. One is that I myself, as a writer, am very suspicious of authorial control. I don't like it. I don't like being in the position of authority. I don't like being in the position of controlling or manipulating the reader's experience. I think as a writer, I'm always trying to think of ways to give up control, to cede control to somebody else, whether that is the reader or in a collaborative way. I'm also working on a collaborative novel right now with 2 artists, and that was very much actively because I wanted to think about how to kind of, throw sand in the gears of authorial control, because I feel, I am as a writer actually quite controlling. And so it's all of my work is to kind of move away from that and to move away from being overly tight with the text in some way. So I think with this book, I really wanted to have it be collaborative with the reader. It was a book that I thought was made hand in hand with the reader, and the trick of writing it was really to write a book that was capacious enough so that there was really room for the reader to step inside of it and make it alongside me. I think the reason why I was interested in writing something that was so open to interpretation and to write a text that felt very mutable and in some ways very volatile is because I am first and foremost a reader. I spend many more hours of the day reading than I do writing. I've been a reader for my entire life. I've actually, been a writer for less than half of my life. And I'm very, very aware of the ways in which reading is a deeply creative act. It's an incredibly active act. It's really not passive in any way. There's so much about the way we consume media, social media, but also films and television that can feel a little bit passive, I think. Reading is, to me, the opposite. It's an incredibly active act. It's an act of creation on the part of the reader. And I've always been very aware of how much a text changes depending on who is reading it and when they're reading it. So, I read Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady when I was 19, and I thought it was about a young woman, going forth in the world and making her fortune, building her life. The second time I read it, when I was in my 30s, I thought it was clearly something very, very different. And I thought it was a novel about disappointment and about a woman who had been broken in some way. So the fact that that novel could contain multiple readings felt to me so wonderful. And that was something that I think I wanted to try to do in this book, is to write something that felt really mutable and changeable. And I often describe it as a rabbit duck drawing. These drawings, children's drawings they have, where if you look at it from one angle, it's a kind of rabbit head with 2 ears. And if you look at it from another angle, it's the beak of the duck. And the drawing represents 2 different things, but the kind of magic of the drawing is to be able to see both of those things at the same time. So that is the kind of mutability I was interested in trying to achieve in the book.
Στο ίδιο πλαίσιο νομίζω ότι εντάσσεται και μια άλλη τεχνική, το να είναι ο κεντρικός σας χαρακτήρας ανώνυμος. Δεν έχουμε το όνομα, ενώ ξέρουμε το Τόμας, ξέρουμε τους υπόλοιπους χαρακτήρες, αλλά την ηθοποιό, την κυρία της Οντισιόν, δεν την μαθαίνουμε. Αυτό σχετίζεται με την ταύτιση ή σχετίζεται με την ρευστότητα των ταυτοτήτων που είναι τόσο εμφανής μέσα στο βιβλίο σας?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm really fascinated by identification, with the point of identification that a reader makes. And it is certainly true, I think. So my characters for the last 3 novels have all been narrated by first-person female narrators who are unnamed. You learn very, very little biographical information about them. You don't really know where they're from. You don't know anything about their childhood. You don't know anything about their history of their, romantic relationships. That is all absent deliberately from the book. But instead, I kind of took the wager that by dropping the reader into the point of view of these characters, you could achieve the necessary identification for a reader to read the book. So my belief is that, readers identify with a character not simply because they have certain characteristics that feel similar to them. I don't know, they're the same age or same rough demographic, but instead because they are drawn into seeing the world the way that the characters see them. Having said that, one of the interesting things about meeting people who have read the book is that I think, and this is a kind of example of my own assumptions as both a writer and a reader. I think I assumed, because it is narrated in the first person, you never leave the head of this character. In fact, you're slightly trapped in her head. I think I assumed that all readers would identify with her. And for that reason, to me, I always thought of the book as very much a book about mothering and parenthood and what it means to be a parent. But when I was touring with the book in the United States, a lot of young men came up to me afterwards and said that they had identified with a young man and that they felt that the book was very much a book about being parented rather than parenting. And so I think it's just such a wonderful sign of the ways that actually as writers you can't control the point of identification for a reader. That is really up to the reader themselves.
Και ίσως να σχετίζεται και με το ότι θα τη χαρακτηρίσω τη γλώσσα που χρησιμοποιείται μια γλώσσα ασάφειας. Πολύ μαεστρικά δε. Θα αναφέρω ένα παράδειγμα. Όλη η ιστορία εκείνη, όταν λόγω μιας ασαφούς δημοσιογραφικής διατύπωσης, ένας νεαρός πιστεύει ότι μία ηθοποιός είναι η μητέρα του. Γιατί η δημοσιογράφος αρνήθηκε να γράψει τη λέξη αποβολή έκτρωση και έγραψε κάτι άλλο που άφηνε να υπονοηθεί ότι έχει γεννηθεί το παιδί. Φέρνει λοιπόν ένα νεαρό σε ένα θέατρο αναζητώντας την φυσική του μητέρα. Δείχνει επίσης όλο αυτό ότι σας αφορά πολύ και αυτό που μένει έξω από τις λέξεις, το αδιατύπωτο, το οποίο όμως θέλει μια μαεστρία για να υπάρχει εκεί την ώρα που δεν υπάρχουν οι λέξεις. Αυτή η ασάφεια, έτσι τη χαρακτηρίζω, δεν βρίσκω άλλη λέξη, γιατί υπάρχει, θέλω να πω, τι υπηρετεί στο συγκεκριμένο βιβλίο. Δεν ήταν το μοναδικό παράδειγμα που ανέφερα, αυτό που μπορώ να αναφέρω, να φέρω στην κουβέντα μας.
I think in the case of the example that you're citing, I mean, the young man comes to this woman and he's trying to explain to her why he believes that he is her son, and he cites a newspaper article, an interview with her that had been published some years ago, in which she recalls that she said to the journalist that she had an abortion, and she used the character uses the word quite specifically because she felt that it was a word that people were oddly coy about in the culture. That it wasn't a word that she felt was being used sufficiently, and she wanted to use the word. And in fact, the journalist in the quotations veers around it and uses language like gave up, I think. I can't quite remember, but I think she says something like gave up a child. And, I'm very interested in the reluctance to use certain kinds of language and certain specifically words. And I think I'm interested in that perhaps less as a literary technique and more as thinking in terms of politics, really, particularly, I would say, in the United States. It was during the period that I was writing this book, it was fascinating the extraordinary reluctance to use the word genocide to describe what was taking place in Gaza, despite the fact that that is a word with a very, very precise definition that had been met by standards of many international bodies. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about even within the American media, there is a reluctance to use the word authoritarianism in relationship to the Trump administration during, I would say, the early few months of it. I think even now there is a real reluctance to use that word. Those words are incredibly charged, but I think it's important that they are used when the definition is met. So I think that was really why I was thinking about that avoidance of a certain vocabulary. When I was writing the book itself, Roe versus Wade, which is the American constitutional right to women to have the choice of whether or not to have an abortion. This was before that was overturned, but it was pretty clear that that was going to be overturned, even as I was writing this book. So I think it was really, that was what I was thinking about specifically in that context. But I think you're also right, probably more generally in my style, I am interested in people, in the movement of a mind on the page is always what I'm trying to achieve. And so I'm always more interested in a voice, in a character who, as she is thinking, isn't necessarily able to apprehend the perfect metaphor on the first try, but instead, says it could be A, or it could be B, or it could be C, and there is a kind of movement towards the ideal expression of a thought, which to me is much more how the mind works. I think one of the wonderful, and in many cases very pleasurable, lies of first-person narration is that people speak in beautiful, complete sentences with perfect metaphors all the time. I'm much more interested in the relationship to language that is about grasping, and in some cases about failing to reach a kind of ideal expression, because I think that's actually much more interesting to me linguistically.
Είναι η δύναμη των λέξεων στις οποίες αναφερθήκατε. Εγώ θα ήθελα να μείνουμε λίγο σε αυτό, γιατί δεν υπάρχει καμία πλειοδοσία λεκτική στα κείμενά σας. Οι λέξεις δεν έχουν περιττά κοσμήματα, δεν υπάρχει ένας γλωσσικός πλούτος που φτιάχνει την ιστορία. Αντιθέτως, βλέπουμε στιγμές πολύ υψηλής ψυχολογικής έντασης με τις λιγότερες δυνατές λέξεις. Αυτό είναι μια τεχνική, δεν ξέρω αν σχετίζεται με την ικανότητά σας και με την επαγγελματική σας ιδιότητα που είσαστε καθηγήτρια δημιουργικής γραφής στο Πανεπιστήμιο. Ωστόσο, θα ήθελα να μας σχολιάσετε λίγο πώς το πετυχαίνετε, ποιος είναι αυτός ο τρόπος που γράφετε και ενώ οι λέξεις είναι λίγες, απλές, υπάρχει μια απίστευτη εξαιρετική λιτότητα κειμενική, να μπορεί να αναδεικνύει όχι μόνο υψηλής έντασης συναισθήματα και εσωτερικές συγκρούσεις, αλλά και να δείχνει και την πολυπλοκότητα της ανθρώπινης ύπαρξης. Σε μια εποχή, μάλιστα, που ίσως και λόγω των social media και της ζωής που κάνουμε, καλούμαστε συνεχώς να παίρνουμε αμέσως θέση, καταδικάζουμε, αποθεώνουμε κάτι, είναι άσπρο ή μαύρο. Εδώ βλέπουμε στο κείμενό σας, χάρη σε αυτή την λεκτική του ομορφιά, όλο το εύρος και όλο τον πλούτο της ανθρώπινης διάστασης.
Thank you for saying that. That's extraordinarily kind of you. I mean, I think I've always had quite a spare style. That's actually something that I think I've tried to fight against in a lot of ways, in part because I feel, that literature is more than just a succession of beautiful sentences. I've really tried to move away from that model of writing where, every sentence is perfect. I'm much more interested in kind of imperfection. I want to have the kind of daring to write bad sentences. I want to have I want to not let the preoccupation with style get in the way of an expression of an idea or the creation of a certain effect. So I think part of the simplicity of the style really has to do with that, is a kind of decoupling of my ambition as a writer from kind of creation of beauty, so to speak, and towards something else. I mean, I think so strongly that often what I'm interested in is the things exactly that characters aren't able to admit even to themselves. I'm often always interested in kind of indicating the kind of negative space that the characters can't fill in, that they can't look at, that they can't even shine a light on, but that nonetheless has extraordinary power both in controlling the emotional weather of these characters, but also of driving the kind of plot and the narrative and the atmosphere of the entire book. So I've always, you know, I often do write more. I often will state things much more directly, and then I'll try to leave it in, and then it just sits more and more badly with me, and then I go back and I end up having to take it out. So I think it does start to it is quite a restrained voice, I suppose, but I have tried to loosen it up over the years.
Όταν ξεκινήσατε να γράψετε την Οντισιόν, ξέρετε πώς θα ξεκινήσετε το δεύτερο μέρος? Με αυτή την πολύ μεγάλη αντίθεση και με αυτή την πολύ μεγάλη διαφορά όσον αφορά πια τους ρόλους.
Yeah, well, so the starting point for the novel for me is when I had read a headline in a newspaper that read, "A stranger told me he was my son." And I didn't read the article because I knew from the moment I read that sentence that I wanted to write a novel about it in some way. But I really struggled to find a way to make that leap from a sentence into the world of a novel. And I sat with it for a few years. I actually wrote a completely different book. And then I came back to it, and I was discussing it with a friend of mine who had, at the time, her son was in his early 20s. And I told her about the headline, and she just looked at me and said, "That's just a description of motherhood. Every time my son comes home from university, it's like a stranger has walked into the apartment." And I thought at that moment that that's actually what I want to write about. I want to write about how within these very universal experiences of motherhood, of marriage, of making art, of friendship, there remain real contradictions, things that feel like they can't be reconciled in any way, things that feel almost mutually exclusive, you know, the stranger and the son. Before a long time, I thought I was going to write about that. And I started writing the book, and it was initially very straightforward. It was about a couple without a child who met this charismatic young man, and they take him into their home and their life, and they start to role play that he was or is their child. And I wrote about 30 or 40 pages of that novel, and it was really like I was driving down a straight road that was very brightly lit, and I could see the destination, and I knew with total confidence that I could get there. And my feeling as a writer, as a reader, rather than a writer, but really as a reader, I feel like when I read a book and I can smell when the writer is not taking a risk. I can tell when the writer knows that they have all the capacity and all the tools to execute everything that is required of them in order to deliver this particular story. And some of that tension of the novel falls away, because my feeling is that tension in a novel, which is something that we talk about all the time, doesn't actually come from plot. It actually comes from the writer's relationship to what is happening in the book and how they are executing it. And so I think if the writer does not have anything at stake in the writing of the book, if they're not taking a risk, if the kind of ghost of failure isn't, you know, heavy at their shoulder, then the book is unlikely to be very good. So I took a big pause, and I tried to think about what I really wanted to do in the book, and I thought, rather than writing about this sense of disjunction, this sense of things being contradictory, what if I actually wrote it directly into the structure of the book itself? And so I set out to do that. And the entire time I really didn't know if it would work, and often I still don't know if it works. It doesn't, you know, it's something that you don't know if it works. But I kept saying to myself, if it doesn't work, I know how to do it. the kind of normal way, and I can go back to doing that. So I didn't know, and it felt kind of like taking a little bit of a jump, but it was also a very exhilarating writing process because of that.
Πλησιάζουμε προς το τέλος και θα δώσω σε λίγο το λόγο στο κοινό μας, στους φίλους και στις φίλες που είναι μαζί μας, για να ρωτήσουν ό,τι θέλουν, να σας ρωτήσουν ό,τι θέλουν. Εγώ θα κλείσω με τον χωρισμό του άλλου σας βιβλίου που έχει ελληνικό τοπόσιμο, τη Μάνη, και θα ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω πρώτα απ' όλα πώς σας φάνηκαν τα Χανιά, αλλά και πώς θεωρείτε ότι επηρεάζει ο τόπος τη γεωγραφία των συναισθημάτων. Γιατί στο χωρισμό, που θα επανακυκλοφορήσει το βιβλίο από τις εκδόσεις Διόπτρα, στο χωρισμό νομίζω ότι αυτό το αντιλαμβανόμαστε με το μυρολόι των γυναικών της Μάνης.
Yeah, I wrote a novel that is set in Mani, and I had gone there in my mid-20s for some period when I was researching a documentary that was... The documentary itself was about psychoanalysis and cinema, but for very precise reasons, we were researching professional mourners, and so I spent a period of a few weeks there filming professional mourners. That was the reason why we were there. But I really did fall in love with the landscape, which is completely extraordinary. It's deeply cinematic. It feels like Antonioni's L'Avventura, I think. And so I was there, and the entire time I was there, I had this feeling of that there was a kind of story waiting to happen. And I should say that the novel is about a woman who is separated from her husband, and he goes missing and is eventually found dead. And it is very much a novel that is about grief. And during that period when I was in Mani, in fact, my father was very ill, and he was dying from cancer. And I think there was really a way in which that tremendous sense of grief saturated the entire landscape for me and made it a very, very emotional one. So it was very powerful to me, and I wrote a novel that was set there. And it's wonderful to be here. It feels much happier than I felt at that time when I was in Mani, but it is... It feels, you know, it is extraordinarily beautiful. Yeah, just walking here to come to this event, I thought this is really special.
Χαιρόμαστε που σας αρέσει. Υπάρχουν ερωτήσεις? Υπάρχει κάποια που θα ήθελε να θέσει κάποιο ζήτημα από αυτά που θίξαμε ή από αυτά που δεν θίξαμε? Ναι, παρακαλώ. Πρέπει να βρεθεί. Τώρα. Δεν ξέρω, αφήστε μου ένα δευτερόλεπτο, δεν ξέρω αν υπάρχει δυνατότητα να έχετε ένα μικρόφωνο και να μεταφραστεί και δώστε μας ένα δευτερόλεπτο και θα το κάνουμε. Ναι. Εδώ, στον κύριο. Ωραία.
Υπάρχει κάποια ιδιότυπη σχέση ή συνάφεια με το πένθος και την καταγωγή σας? Γι' αυτό πλησιάσατε και είδατε με αυτή τη σκοπιά το χορό των γυναικών της Μάνης που κλαίνε τους νεκρούς και όλα, τα μυρολόγια και όλα αυτά. Και το δεύτερο είναι αν στο στυλ της γραφής σας που αναφέρθηκε και η κυρία Ορφανίδου έχει σχέση κάπως με τα χαϊκού και αν ξέρετε και τον Έλληνα ποιητή που έγραψε χαϊκού.
I don't know the Greek poet who writes haiku. Who is that? I don't know them. But in terms of the question, I mean, you know, I grew up in a dual language household. My parents are Japanese. And certainly until I was about 5, Japanese was my first language. And then, I was in growing up in California, and very quickly English took over, and English is the only language that I can write in. But one of the great benefits of growing up in a household that was not necessarily oriented primarily towards Western culture is that I grew up with a different canon of literature. So, writers like Kenzaburo Oe, Kawabata, Tanizaki, those were really the gods in my household when I was growing up. Those were the books that, particularly once I was, a teenager, those were the books that Mishima as well, to a certain extent, those were the books that my parents wanted me to read. And they have a very, it's very often noted in the United States that my books are very short by American standards. And I always say that that is really the length of the Japanese novel. The novels by Kawabata and Tanizaki are all very, very short. So I think I have, in a lot of ways, been influenced by those writers. In terms of the professional mourners, it was funny, I have a very good friend who we had children at the exact same time, and anytime we got together, we would talk about children and not talk about what we were doing. She's a very extraordinary artist. But it turned out that we were both making work about the same thing. I was writing this novel about professional mourners, and she was working on this extraordinary installation in New York that featured, I think, 12 or 13 different professional mourners from around the world. And it's a tradition that, in fact, takes place in many, many different places. I think she did have mourners from Greece as well. But it speaks, I think, to a really deep and quite profound human need, which is that in times of true crisis, we are not able to directly express our emotions, and we need somebody else to do that. There's this kind of technical psychoanalytic term for it, which is interpassivity, but this idea that, somebody else does the labor of mourning for us, and then eventually we are able to reach the state where we are able to grieve, to perform our grief in the kind of recognizable ways. And I think that is something that is obviously deeply rooted in a particular culture here, but that is also replicates itself around the world.
Κάποιος άλλος?
Ο Γιώργος Εφέρης έχει γράψει χαϊκού και έχουν εκδοθεί. Και νομίζω ότι είναι η δική μου ταπεινή γνώμη ότι είναι πολύ πετυχημένα. Και ήταν πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον το perception του πένθους που μας ανάλυσε και ευχαριστούμε γενικά για τις ερωτήσεις.
Υπάρχει άλλη ερώτηση?
Σας
ακούμε.
Στο βιβλίο σας «Χωρισμός» μαθαίνουμε ότι μπορεί να είμαστε με έναν άνθρωπο μια ολόκληρη ζωή και να μην τον έχουμε μάθει, να μην έχουμε καταλάβει ποιος πραγματικά είναι. Αυτό πιστεύετε ότι έχει να κάνει με κάποιο λάθος που κάνουμε εμείς στη ζωή, με κάτι, τι είναι αυτό που κάνουμε και δεν μπορούμε να είμαστε μια ζωή με έναν άνθρωπο και να μην καταλάβουμε τελικά ακριβώς ποιος είναι, αλλά να το μαθαίνουμε μετά το θάνατό του?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for reading my book. I appreciate it very much. I think I think people are different. I'm so sorry because I couldn't actually locate where the question was coming from, so I feel like I'm not looking in the right direction. I apologize. I'm here. I'm oriented better now. What do I think about? I think the possibility of fully knowing another person is one of the great mysteries, and is something that is. I don't want to say that it's not possible, but I suppose I question whether or not that is ultimately the goal that we should be organizing our relationships around. I'm very fascinated by the fact that, particularly in American culture, there is a real fascination with total transparency between people, particularly in couples, in relationships. The idea that we should have no secrets from each other, you know, it's almost like a mantra, like no secrets between couples. I don't know that I think secrets are a good idea, but I do think it's important that people have a little bit of privacy, that they have a kind of space where they are themselves, for themselves and for nobody else, even within a relationship. And so I'm married to a writer, to another novelist, and I think one of the great joys of our marriage is the fact that in a lot of ways our fiction is very private. It's something that we don't share with each other until it's done. And so for many, you know, the terrain of his inner life as he is writing his novels for the years that he is writing them is not open to me. It's not available to me. And that's actually, I'm okay with that. And I think it's that privacy is something that certainly I require in order to write. But I wonder if one also requires it just to exist fully as a person. And so that's something I wouldn't want to ever take away from somebody. So I don't know if that answers your question, but thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Κυρία Κιταμούρα, ευχαριστώ και εγώ προσωπικά. Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ όλες για αυτή την ωραία στιγμή και κλείνουμε με τον αρμόζοντα τρόπο.
Thank you so much for your wonderful question.